We're good to go? Excellent. Well, good afternoon, everyone. How are you all doing? I'm Tom Goodwin. I'm Associate Director of Policy here at CLES, the Centre for Local Economic Strategies. I'd like to offer you a very warm welcome and say a big thank you for joining us here today for the last in this series of 3 conversations that we here at CLES have convened with our fellow travellers on the journey towards economic, social and climate justice. So my colleague Helen is just going to post links actually to the rest of the series in the chat, so you can watch those other webinars back at your leisure, should you so desire. Just a reminder, the first was a discussion between myself and Adam Lent from New Local, looking at community power. The second was a discussion between the academic Lara Roth and CLES's very own Eleanor Radcliffe, looking at the feminisation of politics. But in today's webinar, we're going to be looking at the relationship between Doughnut Economics and community wealth building. And I'm really delighted to be joined by the economist Kate Raworth, who is, of course, the author of the best-selling book, Doughnut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist. Just a short introduction, Kate is a senior associate at Oxford University's Environmental Change Unit, where she teaches on the Masters in Environmental Change and Management. She's also Professor of Practice at Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. Kate has written extensively for the media, and The Guardian has named her as one of the top 10 tweeters on economic transformation. Alongside Kate, I'm also delighted to be joined today by CLES's very own Chief Executive, Sarah Longlands. So Sarah is an expert in regional and local economic development. And before recently joining CLES, Sarah was, of course, Director at IPPR North, the dedicated think tank for the north of England. Sarah has previously worked at CLES until 2011 and began her career in local government, working in both County Durham and North Yorkshire. Sarah also has a PhD in urban studies from the University of Glasgow. Okay, so we'll get things going properly in a moment, but just let me get a little bit of brief housekeeping out of the way. It's all fairly straightforward. Just to let you know that we'll be recording today's session and we'll send you a link to that as soon as it's available. We do want you to feel as involved as you can be on a Zoom webinar, so please do use the chat function box at the bottom of your screens to introduce yourself, to say hello to the rest of the audience, and of course to us as well. Finally, if you do have any questions to Kate or to Sarah, please don't use the chat function box, actually use the Q&A box to pose these, and then you'll be able to upvote and comment on each other's questions too. So yeah, if you could use this to keep the debate lively, that would be brilliant. So just to give you a sense of how we'll run things then for the next hour. So I'll just start in a minute by just giving a little bit of context behind today's event. I'll then ask Kate and Sarah a series of short questions around what's wrong with current approaches to economics and economic development. I'll get them to outline what the alternative could look like. So we'll unpack the donut and we'll get to grips with community wealth building, and we'll start to explore the intersections between these 2 responses. After that, we should have some time to take some questions from you good selves out in the audience, and we'll look to wrap up at around 3 p.m. So without further ado then, let me just start with a bit of context setting. And just very briefly, in case you're new to CLES, you don't know who we are, we're of course the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, the National Organisation for Local Economies, and we're very much committed to realising progressive economics for people, for place and for planet. And we have a firm commitment to places and communities across the UK who are experiencing social and economic inequality and lack of opportunity. And our fundamental aim really in all of this is to achieve social justice, good local economies and effective public services for everybody, everywhere. In this, we describe ourselves as a think do tank. So we think, of course, but we're very much about getting out there, working on the ground, using the experience of practice to inform our thinking. As well, before I kind of get Kate and Sarah to explain what's wrong with current approaches to economics and economic development, let me just start though by briefly saying something about the moment that we now find ourselves in. So, of course, for the last 18 months, we've been in the grip of a major public health and economic event of historical importance. It's potentially unprecedented in its magnitude in peace times, huge effect on our economy, of course, as well as our public health. But it's important to say that the operating context before COVID was already affected by a series of long-standing crises. just before the COVID hit in 2020. We learned that poverty had hit a record high, 14 million people in the UK now living in poverty, more than 1 in 5 of the population, including 4 million children, 2 million pensioners. Almost 1 million people now have no guaranteed work from one week to the next. And we also had the refreshed version of the Marmot Review, which revealed a stalling life expectancy for the first time in a century. And actually that this life expectancy is stalling, particularly in areas of deprivation. So shocking statistics, really. And of course, with all of this, we also face the ongoing mortal threat of climate emergency, the full fury of which seems to have appeared almost everywhere this summer. So we've seen waves of violent extreme weather that smashed heat and rain records. It's killed hundreds of people and reminded us that unless we urgently change tack, that our planet remains on a pathway to human-made destruction. And I suppose the worry with all of this is that what we're seeing at the moment is a rush back to the old normal. The sense of we just need to get back to our offices, we just need to get the roaring 20s up and running. But, based on what we had before COVID, this really amounts to little more than let's get the old patterns of wealth extraction, power and inequality back in play. And I think there's a strong sense then that if the purpose of our economy is to be more than just a wealth generating system for an elite few, given where we are at the moment with those statistics, our economy is failing to deliver positive outcomes for people, for place, and for planet. But of course, with alternatives like Doughnut Economics and community wealth building, we've got the promise of something different. So let's now move into an exploration of these two concepts then. So Kate, if we could start with you, and where do you think current approaches to economics, economic development are going wrong, and how does the Doughnut provide a different path? So yeah, over to you.
Great, thanks. And I'm just really delighted to be having this conversation. I'm looking forward to the whole hour. So I'm going to kick off quickly. I'm going to move fast through this. Here's a donut, right? This is the only one that's good for us. The goal is leave no one falling short on the essentials of life. No one without food, healthcare, education, housing, income, community, social equity, equality. Leave no one in the hole. But at the same time, don't overshoot the life supporting systems of our planetary home. In other words, aim to meet the needs of all within the means of the living planet. If that's the donut, we are very far from it right now, as all the red shows. This is the global donut. But you know what? I'm just going to talk to the UK donut, because we know that if we created a UK donut, we would see red inside and red outside. We would find, Tom, you just gave some really shocking stats on UK deprivation, people living in poverty without sufficient food, going to food banks, inadequate healthcare, education, housing, not accessing the basic essential services we need for a good life, and growing rates of inequality. And we know the UK is contributing to ecological breakdown through climate change, through our excessive national ecological footprint, through our uses of Earth's resources. So we need to turn this story around. Now, we have to remember that last century's economic theories and government policies and business models and community actions were not designed to solve for these double crises. We have to come up with solutions of our own time and our own generation. So how do we do this? Let me start with, how can we bring ourselves back within planetary boundaries? Well, we've inherited, I've got lots of toys here today, we've inherited linear degenerative industrial systems like the hose pipe of production. We make things from Earth's resources, stick them in the pipe of production, make them in stuff we want, use them for a while and throw them away. And that linear degenerative economy is what pushes us over planetary boundaries. So we have to turn the linear economy into a circular or cyclical one, where resources aren't used up, they're used again and again, far more collectively, more carefully, more slowly and more creatively. Refurbishing, repurposing, reusing, sharing resources to meet our needs. So that's the first, how we come back within these planetary boundaries. But at the same time, we need to eliminate this human deprivation. How do we do that? We need to change one other dynamic. We've inherited economies that are divisive by design. They concentrate value and opportunity in the hands of a few, whether through legislation, through inherited privilege, through infrastructure, through culture. They tend to channel that. And we've seen it globally in the rise of the 1%, but we also see it nationally in rising inequality. We need to transform divisive economies into distributive ones, where that value and opportunity created is shared far more equitably with all who co-created, and that turns out to be the whole of society. So In short, we need to go from degenerative to regenerative industrial design, and we need to move from divisive to distributive economies. That's the essence of Doughnut Economics. And it means that we need to move away from our inherited dependency on endless growth. This is the shape of progress that we hear economists and politicians speaking to all the time. The idea is that a nation's progress is growing endlessly, and it gets measured in GDP. And no matter how rich a nation already is, that its success lies upon yet more growth indefinitely. To me, we need to move away from that towards regenerative and distributive design. And I'm so delighted to be in this conversation because I see community wealth building and the work of CLES is absolutely connected to this. Looking forward to how we can talk about those interconnections. Thanks.
Great stuff. Thank you, Kate. Yeah, and we're loving the use of props already as the feedback that we're getting from the audience. Yeah, and I think that sense of kind of like this weddedness to growth. Yeah, I think there's definitely real kind of synergies there, and we'll get into that a little bit in a moment. But Sarah, then, if I could just kind of pose the same question to you, but with a bit more of a local context. You know, from your point of view, why is local economic development failing, and how does community wealth building provide something different?
Yeah, thanks, Tom, and thanks, Kate. So interesting and exciting to be in this conversation with you today, kind of bringing our kind of shared enthusiasm for a different type of economy into one space. I think for me, I want to talk, as Tom says, from a local perspective, and what is going wrong, and what can we do using community wealth building as a tool to try and put it right. And at the heart of our approach to community wealth building, it really reflects what Kate's just said. We talk about the need to change from an extractive model, a kind of Hoover model of economic development, towards a much more generative, developmental model of economic development. So I think already we can see like really close parallels between what we're both trying to achieve. And for me, the challenge that we face locally kind of is threefold, really. First of all, as Kate's just said, there's a real emphasis on growth. And when you whatever flavor you're talking about, whether it's sustainable growth, inclusive growth, green growth, there's just too much explicit emphasis placed on growth as the desired outcome for place. And that's something that's always struck me throughout my career, that no matter who I spoke to, no matter which area it was, places said, well, the objective here is to grow our economy. And I was always kind of like trying to dig beneath that. What is that a metaphor for, if you like? Well, actually what people meant was, decent jobs, higher incomes, new people and businesses moving into a locality, not necessarily a figure of GDP and an increase as such. It was much more implicitly about improving people's lives. But explicitly, all we see is the growth word. And I think that detracts from actually what we're trying to achieve here in local areas, or a better life for people and a good life for people, regardless of where they start. And the other challenge with the growth is that even if you get growth, if you're lucky enough to get some growth, it doesn't actually solve your problems. In fact, sometimes it makes it even worse. Think congestion, think house prices, and actually, there's no automaticity that even when you get that growth, that anybody that you care about is actually going to benefit from it. There's no evidence actually that the benefits really trickle down, at least within anybody's lifetime. And the final question is, if growth is your objective, well, what do you do in the meantime? What do you do? You've still got social challenges. You've still got challenges of land and property. You can't just sit around waiting for growth to arrive before you do something about it. So that's the first challenge, that the emphasis on growth. And what community wealth building says is, instead of focusing on growth, focus on people, focus on improving people's quality of life, focus on improving work, on income, on the way that we use land and assets, focus on improving the way in which we use the resources we already have in an area, whether that's local expenditure, local procurement expenditure, or local assets, and focus on that instead, rather than waiting for the great white horse of inward investment or whatever to come over the hill. So that's the first thing. The second challenge is about governance. In a time of crisis, when we're trying to deal with multiple issues, pandemic recovery, inequality, climate change, we need areas to have a much higher level of self-management. We need to harness the local creativity, knowledge and connection to place to develop the ideas that will help people see a way through. Instead of always waiting for central government to come up with the next big idea or for private sector to come in on their white charger of inward investment. And I think one of the challenges in the UK is that organisations who drive economic locally are still very much beholden to a government, whether that's at Westminster, at Holyrood, Stormont or Cardiff. And even regional organisations like local enterprise partnerships in England are often answerable to a centralised system of governance. So how can we reshape economic governance so as to help deliver fairer economies which put well-being and people at their heart? And community wealth building can help to do this by democratising the economy, providing new mechanisms for voices to be heard and for action, crucially, to be taken. And community wealth building, where we run it across the country, encourages collaboration, encourages a sharing of resources, of time and of information in order to kind of work together to make the best use of resources and deal with the real challenges that place faces. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing is kind of reclaiming what we mean by economy. I was just saying before we started, I was in a conversation earlier where someone was telling me that a survey was done recently of MPs, and they were asked about the extent to which they thought that that civil society was part of the economy, and just 1% of MPs agreed that social and community organisations were part of the economy. So I think that tells you something just about how narrow often our perception of what an economy is at the local level. And we would argue very much in community wealth building that what makes a good economy is the coming together of the private sector with the public sector and the civil society, community and voluntary organisations who own assets, who employ people and who invest in neighbourhoods and are often really community anchors in their areas and play a really important role in the economy, but also the public sector in shaping and influencing and supporting local areas and supporting the economy directly. And we've seen that during the pandemic, and we've seen it at a national level through things like furlough. And take one example of that at a local level, planning. You know, planning is much maligned, much critiqued, but it's the development of a local plan which sets out how land in terms of employment and residential use, which actually provides some semblance of stability to an otherwise chaotic marketplace. And it can help to manage speculative build, and it can help to build in safeguards. So those are the kind of, I mean, there's lots of other issues that I could talk about, but those are three kind of really important points that we think at CLES are real challenges at the local level, and a bit of an indicator of how we think community wealth building can help to deal with them. And just to kind of sum it up, for us, community wealth building is the creation of a generative economy where wealth is owned and shared equally, where organisations are generous, where the good that we're seeking is about making people's lives better. And it's also about kind of rediscovering our public and civic mission to people's lives, and you know, an economy which serves and delivers for people and not the other way around. So really excited to be joining the conversation, and I'm looking forward to hearing everybody's questions as well.
Thanks, Sarah. That's great. Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating stuff from both of you there, really. I mean, I think, you know, it's clear that, you know, there's a lot of intersection that we're all singing from the same hymn sheet here. There's a kind of a strong political economy narrative underpinning both approaches. But yeah, I'd love to kind of unpack this kind of intersection a little bit more. I mean, and just kind of consider about, well, how do the two concepts relate to each other? You know, I'm interested in, I suppose, is community wealth building more of a delivery mechanism for the donor? Is the donor a delivery mechanism for community wealth building? You know, how do you think that the two relate to each other? Kate, if I could put that question to you first.
Sure, and let me say that the main thing I've been doing since Doughnut Economics came out was setting up Doughnut Economics Action Lab, co-founding it with a colleague, because when I used to present the book, people come up and say, and I'm actually doing this, I'm teaching it in the classroom, I'm bringing it into my social enterprise, I'm taking it into my community organisation, I'm taking it into my town planning meeting. And so we set up Doughnut Economics Action Lab because I actually profoundly believe that 21st century economics is going to be practiced first and theorized later, and this is the practice. So we work a lot with towns and cities that approach us and say, we like the concept of the donut. What would it mean to put it into practice here? The best known example is Amsterdam, but other places from Leeds, now Glasgow is starting internationally as well. Devon, Barbados, Curacao, all sorts of places come to us, and we say, okay, so the question is, how do you make your city regenerative by design, and how are you going to make it far more distributive by design? And we always work with them, quickly moving to these 5 deep design traits of cities that we talk about. And yes, I do have another toy for this. This has been my mainstay throughout lockdown. It's probably the thing I've held up the most, because we say, look, whether or not you're stuck on the path of growth, and most city mayors will say, yeah, we've been answered for decades. We've been like, how do we make our city grow? Oh, look at our city GDP. And they want to move away from that. We want to make our city thrive. So how do we do that? Well, it depends upon these 5 deep design traits and pivoting them towards enabling you to move to that regenerative, thriving future. So what's your purpose? As Sarah just mentioned, having a public and civic mission. What is your purpose and your intention as a city emerging from this crisis? On the long view, who do you want to become? What does this city stand for? And then how do you network with other cities and progressive cities that are doing this as well? But crucially, how do you network with your own residents? And how do you use deliberative democracy and it really engaged decision-making, recognizing the strength of many, many networks in your city? I'm going to move through this fast. How do you govern? So who has voice in decision-making? Who's in the room when that happens? What are the metrics of success that you're using in your city? What are the regulations that you're putting in place? Amsterdam is going to have no fossil fuel cars or boats in it by 2030. That is really clear regulatory governance, but there's also soft regulation, like cities like Bogota using clowns to mimic people behaving badly in the traffic, and it works. So what are the regulations and all the different forms of governance? Now, let me go deeper. How is the city owned? And I'll tell you, at that point, sometimes city staff, they scratch their head like, what are you talking about? So, well, who owns the sources of wealth creation in your city? So who owns the land and the housing? In Vienna, 60% of people live in social housing, because the city of Vienna decided that housing is not an investment option, it's a human right. And so the city housing is predominantly owned by the city or city-run cooperative. That is, of course, transformative in affordability and who lives there. Who owns the utilities? Paris privatized its water supply, realized it made a terrible mistake. They've now brought it back under public control, because it matters who has control of the city's water and who gains the revenue from doing that and who can design its future. Who owns the city's data, knowing the value of that, and who protects the residents' data to ensure they have data sovereignty. Crucially, who owns the enterprises in the city? Why is it that the city of Atlanta in the US has 5 times more Black-owned startups than most other cities around it? Because they've intentionally put action into that. Who owns the enterprises, and are they multinational brands that are on sale in a shopping mall and the money's just leaving, or are they reinvesting? Now, of course, you can hear this has got very, very strong connections here with community wealth building. And let's keep going. How is finance flowing and serving your city? Where does the finance come from? How do you raise money? Is it through car parking charges? How are you going to deal with getting cars out of your city centre if that's where your revenue comes from? Does it come from shop rental, shops? And therefore, no wonder you want everyone to get back into the offices after COVID, because you want the shop, the revenue from those shops to pay your public services. So how is the city funded? What's the city doing with its own funds? How is its own budgets and city pensions invested? And how is the city using procurement, the power of procurement, to drive all of this towards its vision of the city it wants to become? So we use this in workshops with cities, and it opens up great questions of which of these design traits, in which dimensions are you being pulled back to that extractive, old, growth-focused economy? And there's different aspects in all of these where you're going to be pulled back. And what can you change? And what is it about the way your city is already designed that is enabling you to pivot into that future? And how can you enhance that and move with that? So this, when I show this to city policymakers, they really light up, because they can see now we're talking about the deeper stuff. We need to go under the hood and look at this deep design. And when they get excited about ownership, that's when I start immediately saying, oh, community wealth building, do you know about this? And it connects right in to your work and the work of others internationally. really, I think, doing amazing pioneering work of showing that, of course, cities can transform ownership.
Yeah. No, that's great, Kate. I mean, it's there are real synergies there with community wealth, and I'll ask kind of Sarah to talk to some of those. But yeah, I mean, it's good, and it's kind of like this one political economy narrative, and these are all tools and framings to kind of help towards that more progressive, inclusive economy that we kind of so desire. But yeah, Sarah, do you have some reflections on the kind of the synergies between the two concepts?
Yeah, and fascinating to see those 5 points. I think it's something about the power of 5, because in our community wealth building, well, we've got 5 things as well. Now, I haven't got it as nicely presented as you, but these are our 5, which you can't see very well. But they basically, we've got, our first one is around spending. So what is being already spent and used? What are the resources and assets that already exist in a place, and how could you to deliberately use them more to actually target and support better lives and better outcomes for people? We've got a finance headline as well. How can you ensure that the flows of finance actually end up in people's pockets and in the communities where they could have the biggest difference? And I'm thinking of finance as something which actually is not value free. Is actually, there's something about the way which finance operates which needs an ethical framework for it, and sort of raising people's awareness of the fact that they can ask for that as part of the process. So that's the second. Third, around workforce is a really big theme for us. How can organizations already in places, public sector anchors, community anchors, how can they use their own employment process to really support people's lives through decent pay, through a real living wage, and also by supporting good conditions at work and really creating healthy places for people to live. And we know that's something that NHS are already doing in many areas, because they can see that some of those people will end up in NHS hospitals, and if they are not putting their own house in order, then that's creating that kind of linear model that you described so beautifully earlier on. So that's third. Fourth, about land and property, absolutely crucial. How we use land and how we use property is fundamental in terms of ownership, but also in terms of the flows of finance and who owns your place. Who's actually running the place behind the scenes, and where is the money going, and how much of the ownership of property and land in your area is just simply being siphoned off to investors and to banking houses that have no relationship with your town or your city. And then finally, ownership, which again, real synergy with the Doughnut. The ownership really underpins community wealth building. It's about democratizing our economy, about giving everyone a stake in the economy, and I think as well, kind of reconnecting people to the economy, because sometimes the economy just happens around us, and we have to try and fit in with it wherever we are, whether that's about trying to find somewhere to live or to find a job. The economy just happens in spite of us, and I think trying to reconnect people and reconnect the economy to people's lives is crucial. And ownership, I think, for us plays a really fundamental role in that, and helping to create a place which is more generative, which is rich and diverse, and fundamentally is a good place for people to live, really. So those are kind of the 5 pillars or principles that we tend to talk about. So I mean, I think in terms of the relationship, it seems really clear to me that I think we're both trying to encourage people to have these conversations and to start to question and feel a sort of sense of ownership over the idea of economy in their own place, that they don't have to necessarily follow a set model that comes from Westminster or comes from an economic textbook, that there is the freedom and the confidence, if you like, to challenge that and to present something different. And I think it's so important to begin those conversations and to give people the opportunities to have them. And the other kind of the big parallel in what you've said as well is about that collaborative working. And I think that's something that in normal economics and in sort of economic development in particular, there's a sort of a sense of competition always, that places are actively encouraged in, for example, the government's Levelling Up Fund, they're actively encouraged to compete with one another, not to share information, to try and vie for the biggest investor in their area. And I think, trying to break that, to say, actually, we're all part of the same planet, we're all part of the same country, we're all trying to do the same thing here, we're all trying to make lives better for people. So, you know, trying to encourage and support a more collaborative way of thinking about our economy, you know, is, I think, fundamental to what we're both trying to do as well.
Brilliant, thanks. Kate, any reflections back on that before I post something else?
No, I love the resonance, and I was, it makes sense to me that ideas that make sense emerge from different places. It makes sense that these frameworks, Doughnut Economics comes from a more macro view and then reaches into what does this mean in the specifics of an economy. Community wealth building clearly begins embedded in local places. Often I know places that have really lost opportunity, seen, you know, the chips are down, and it emerges out of crisis, as many of the best things do. And it makes sense to me that these connect and they meet, and I'm so pleased they do. And again, on that collaborative point, I see the work that we're all doing as part of a big ecosystem of change makers and the connections between these ideas, and there is no competition between them. They rely upon each other, and we love to point to others' work when the work really wants to get detailed. Say, go there, those folks are really doing that. They can take you, you know, this is if the Doughnut is a portal, it's a way in for some people. Let us point you to the place where the real experts on that specific are happening. So this feels, it makes sense to me that there's strong overlaps in these 5 points that we're sharing.
Yeah, I think there is that real coming together. I guess with our work on community wealth, in the sense maybe it started in practice, but we very quickly saw the political economy narrative that underpinned it. And I guess with Doughnut Economics, you started with that kind of, you know, macro thinking, and then you very quickly attached it to kind of the practical solutions to those problems. So yeah, I think that's where we're getting at here. The next thing I want to pose though is that, you know, this is brilliant. You know, we've got this kind of vision for an alternative. We've got practical solutions. It's great. You know, we've got loads of people enthused on this webinar today, but, you know, we've been having this discussion in CLES. It's like we kind of see that these approaches are kind of now pulling up to the gates of the mainstream almost. And it's like, but how do we get over the gate? How do we, you know, I could sit here now and just pull so many economic strategies off the internet from various places, and they'd all have growth, productivity right up front, as if that's the kind of the be all and end all and the only thing that we need to focus on. So, I mean, how do we get people to take this more seriously? Kate, if I could start with you again, and then pose the same question to Sarah.
So it's a great question, and I'm not going to drum up some simple answer, because it's the front line of the work that we're all doing. And certainly in Doughnut Economics Action Lab, there are cities and places around the world that saying we want to engage with the Doughnut, adopt the Doughnut, and there are really progressive policymakers in those places. And then working and watching them at work, of course, they're embedded in places where there are other people who are resistant to this change. And so they are trying to make change happen within their context. And it is that space of what happens when the new paradigm encounters business as usual, resistance as usual, vested interests that are not interested in this transformation. The strategy we take, to put it's rather than try and answer that question, the strategy we take, one, we go where the energy is, in the sense that we just work with change makers who come to us and say, we want to do this. So we've never tried to introduce this. So I'm imagining it's the same with you. Never try and impose or introduce it. It's when people say, this is the right tool for us now. And I, as somebody embedded in this context, can see a strategic way of making this happen. Two, it's to build a critical mass of change makers in that place who stand in the new space, so that you're not an isolated one or two, but there's a broad coalition. So in Amsterdam, where they've adopted it along with a circular economy policy, there's also a group of residents there have created the Amsterdam Doughnut Coalition, and they're, you know, across civic organizations and universities. And so it's got attraction with people, so that you start to build, instead of trying to speak into and explain yourself and justify yourself in the old terms, you build enough of a language framework, concepts, metrics, and a coherent group of people that we've created a new carpet to stand on. Now we invite the old to come and stand in this space and explain itself and justify itself, and tell us why those old policies and those old pursuits make sense in the current crisis and context. So that's the broad strategy. But look, you're asking me questions literally day to day. This is where we're at. So I would love to learn from, I think CLES has many years of experience in sitting in this space, and the strategy of ensuring that, well, I'll say one last thing. When business as usual meets a disruptive idea, something's going to get transformed. And at Doughnut Economics Action Lab, we always say our job is to make sure it's not us. Our job is to ensure that business as usual is what's transformed. it's not that the edges are rubbed off our work and that we're greenwashed and downgraded and made to nicely fit in and just carried along and eaten for breakfast. So that is the political economy and the very strategic work that we're all doing at the front edge of our work.
Great stuff. Thanks, Kate. Sarah, yeah, any reflections on that, and then from CLES's work and yeah, our experience on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I really like, that point about working with the energy, and that's certainly something that we do at CLES. Working with people who want something different, who have got the appetite, and giving them the tools to be able to kind of realize it in their own communities. I guess that's what gets us up in the morning, really, and motivates us in our work. And I think your point too about you provided a critical mass of people in the space. So we've got our communities of practice, our community wealth building communities of practice now, which brings people who are working in different sectors. So in politics, in local government, in health, and who are all interested in this, and bringing them together to say, well, how are you dealing with this challenge? And this is what we're doing in our community. And I think people find that really supportive in terms of a peer network, and gives them a sense that if they're having a bad time, they've got trouble trying to convince members that this is a good idea, or trouble trying to convince senior management, that there's other people in the room who've been there before and you can help them out. I think that peer support and building that community is so important, especially as it feels like there's real momentum behind these issues, and behind this different approach. So so I think I would definitely agree with that. I think providing a space for debate and discussion, I mean, not only for those people who are perhaps in the room already, but those people who perhaps are standing outside, maybe with their hand on the door handle, but not quite sure, might do it, might not. So like giving them a chance to say, well, look, have you thought about it? Here's some of the challenges. What questions have you got? So I think providing space for those people to come over the threshold and to come onto the carpet, I think is really important too. And that might be a much more inclusive space, and it might be a space as well where you're bringing people in from different political persuasions and different perspectives, and having a conversation about it. And then I think obviously I think sharing what's already going on and giving people a sense that they're achieving something and we are making a difference. And I think on that, I think particularly there's huge momentum for this in the work that we do in Scotland and Northern Ireland, and in Wales. The devolved governments there are really getting on board with it, but there's much less traction in Westminster. But in some ways, there's something also really exciting happening in England. The fact that local authorities themselves are getting on doing this, regardless of what's happening in Westminster. And so I think trying to harness that and give them all the support we can, so that we can build momentum for this, and sort of taking the arguments to Westminster for a change, I think is kind of really, really refreshing. And I kind of also bringing together that experience that you're seeing in other parts of the country, in other parts of the world, into the debate as well. And then finally, I think about the new language, I think is critical. Growth, as Tom says. I was reading something this morning, a local plan. What's it asking for? It's just sustainable economic growth, and I think how do we create new language and how do we encourage people to adopt that is fundamental. So that's some of my thoughts.
Yeah, Kate, any reflections on that?
Agree on the new language, and so I think it's crucial. It's easier to be against something, and if we really want to help people shift, we have to provide the positive alternatives. So in writing Doughnut Economics, I was always trying to replace an old diagram with a new one and an old frame with a new one. I think of concepts and language like intellectual graffiti. It's really hard to rub out. And the best thing you can do is paint an amazing mural over it. And we're seeing new language appear. So I tend to talk about a thriving economy, a thriving society. It doesn't mean it's necessarily growing. It's alive. Something that's thriving might not be getting bigger, but it's clearly flourishing and it's alive and well. We've seen the rise of well-being economies. And again, that's the space where people are trying to find this new language and policymakers are picking it up, the well-being economy. The governments from Scotland and Wales and New Zealand and Iceland starting to say, yeah, we're going for well-being. So they're moving off in a different direction. I think, interestingly, all led by female leaders. Something interesting going on there, but they're looking for that new language and needing a positive new framing to stand behind, so that we can then, wait, why on earth are you still talking about growth? Come on, don't you have a more nuanced purpose, a more focused, human-centric, life-centric purpose. So providing that space on the new carpet with that language and the positive framing and the concepts that go around it. And I think community wealth building is a beautiful phrase in itself. You understand what it is when you hear it, and it really makes sense and it's appealing.
Yeah. Great stuff. We're delightfully on time, I have to say, and I'd like to start mingling in some of the questions from the audience, because we've got some great questions coming in. There is a lot of chat still about growth. I wonder if we just try and not nail it, but just like, I don't know, just to, I mean, why, I suppose, yeah, this summarizes quite a lot of what a lot of people are kind of questioning. Why don't we fix the growth issue by just putting words like inclusive or green in front of it? Is there not a sense that, just to kind of be deliberately provocative here, is there not a sense when we do that, we're not in fact just using growth as a proxy for economic activity, and we're just saying, well, what we want is green economic activity or inclusive economic activity? Is there still, do we have to get rid of the word growth, do you think? Sarah, why don't I come to you first on that one? I'll switch it around.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. And I have to say that I think there is still a problem with growth in the word. I mean, that's the first thing to say. I think that the problem with it is it narrows the vision, and it's explicitly trying to deal with something that is bigger than most of our everyday experience. It's not specific enough about what you're actually trying to achieve through that. What you're trying to achieve is a number and an increase in that number, and so it's very hard to see how that connects to local jobs, to local income, to the way in which people live. So I think that's the problem. It's too abstract and it's too implicit about the human welfare, the human development that we want to see as part of that aspiration. Having said that, one of my experiences has been that in the conversation with people about growth and the critique of growth in local communities, is that sometimes talking about growth more qualitatively, like talk about green growth or sustainable growth or inclusive growth, it can sometimes be a bridging term. It can sometimes be a bit of a bridge to help people move to a situation where we don't need the word growth anymore. So you move from, we want green growth, but actually what we want is a greener economy. And I think sometimes it can help as a bit of a bridging term along the way as people kind of make that journey. And I suppose that's the story of, local economic development too, that, we've kind of moved, we have moved. So, whilst, we can complain about inclusive growth or whatever way, it's better than perhaps what it was 10 years ago when people were just talking about growth and GBA. So yeah, that's some of my thoughts on it.
Thanks. Yeah, Kate, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I really agree with that. Let's step back and think, why is growth an appealing word? It's a really appealing word. Growth is a wonderful, healthy phase of life. It means things are alive and that they're growing. We love to see it in our kids. We love to see it in our plants, in our gardens. So it makes sense as a metaphor that we find it appealing. And some people actually say, but how can you not want growth? They can only feel the appealing side of it. But in nature, nothing aims to grow forever. And things that actually survive and thrive on planet Earth grow and grow up. And if my 12-year-old kids, if they're growing like 2 inches a year, they've just gone past my eye level. It's that intimidating moment. But if they keep growing 2 inches a year, literally forever, they literally would not belong in my household. They could not fit. And that would be a disaster. So we know in our own bodies, if I say my friend went to the doctor and she had a growth, we immediately go quiet and we feel utterly different about it because we understand the other end of this metaphor, that something that tries to grow endlessly can actually destroy the system on which it depends. So I just let's recognize that the wonderful phase of life that's about growth, but then also it's not a endless continual goal in itself. I also want to recognize that growth can easily turn into a kind of macro conversation, and we're looking at the UK's GDP, and we know we have huge inequalities in this nation, and therefore actually there are parts of the UK where you absolutely want to see economic activity rise, as long as it's generating all the things Sarah said, incomes and healthcare and education and opportunity for those people in those communities. So the danger of growth is a bit of an aggregate term, and it actually stops us from differentiating, as Donella Meadows would say, when anyone says growth, you ask growth of what and for whom, and for how long, and how much is enough, and at what cost to the planet. So to nuance it. And the last thing I'll say is, if we do keep the growth, I really like what Sarah said about growth can be a bridging term. We want a green, inclusive, we want green inclusive growth. And then at some point people are happy to say, actually, we just want a green inclusive economy. And I can see the value of the bridge. The danger of the growth word is that that's an economist's word. And the metric of growth is GDP. And therefore, when we make our plan and when push comes to shove and making decisions, it gives us implicit push towards the economist's criteria. Will this new project bring in new investment, and how many pounds? And will it shorten train journey times for high paid people? And so it dangerously could keep us to very narrow economic metrics. So I really like moving from green growth to green economy now, and green inclusive regenerative economy. We're in a very different conversation.
Yeah, no, it's that thing about it's the qualitative nature of the economic activity that we need to start interrogating, isn't it? It's kind of, and I think, as you say, Kate, it's being agnostic about the word growth itself. It's like, fine if things grow a bit, but as long as we've got to get the qualitative nature of that economic activity right. So yeah, that's really good. Yeah, let me bring in some specific questions here. I've got a really interesting one from Councillor Mark Jones, who talks about work exclusion and kind of barriers to employment. And I suppose what does Doughnut Economics have anything to say about that, about helping to kind of bridge barriers to work or progressing on to better works? Yeah, if I could ask that to you first, Kate, and then we'll consider that in terms of community wealth building as well.
Well, so this is a really nice example where Doughnut Economics will move straight to that. So if someone asks me about that, I say, yeah, so when any place is considering these deep designs, you think about your networks. And for example, the example I love is from Cleveland University Hospitals in Cleveland, Ohio. And the story is there's a hospital with, it's a high skill and a really great place to work on the edge of a really low income and deprived neighborhood. And they realized that very few people from that neighborhood worked in the hospital that was right next door. And so they set up a very active employment recruitment plan to enable women coming back from maternity leave, people who didn't have the school qualifications, but if they could do a bridging program, supporting people who had one conviction and giving them that second chance. So creating a bridge to enable people from their own community to work in the hospital. And to me, and if anybody was asking me about that, I'd say, that's the heart of community wealth building. It's the workforce in your 5 points. And that's a beautiful example of where Doughnut Economics would say, if you want to go into that, I point you to our friends doing the detail of community wealth building. There's so much that you can do there. Brilliant.
Yeah. Sarah, do you have anything more to kind of add in on that community wealth building perspective to workforce?
I think Kate articulated it really well. Workforce is something that I am really interested in as part of our work in local authorities, but particularly at the current time where we've got the crises that many people are facing in terms of work and the threat of a cliff edge in the autumn. And I think there's something really important about just thinking about local authorities, anchor organisations, whether they're in the public sector or the community, and how they can use their own workforce strategy to improve outcomes for existing workers, but also create opportunities for people who are potentially losing their jobs at the current time, and also opportunities for progression and for decent work conditions. Just one very quick example from our work in Birmingham, the anchor network there in Birmingham, they've got an initiative they've been developing which is called Hospitality to Health, which has been looking at how we can, a collaborative partnership developed through community wealth building to think about how can we help those people who have lost their jobs or who are stuck on furlough in hospitality and give them opportunities within the health sector, which is crying out for people in this type of crisis. And the anchor network was there, they could see the connection, they could see the synergies, and they've been able to start developing that project. So I think that's another kind of example of where that collaborative sharing approach can really start to help people directly get better, get jobs in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it. I mean, the NHS is actually doing really great stuff in this space. There's a number of trusts now in the UK who are actually thinking, you know what, we're no longer in terms of our entry level positions. We're no longer going to think about it in terms of the best person for the job. We're going to think about it in terms of using our employment capacity to address poverty and deprivation in our local area. I think that's just, it's such a powerful switch that you can see, you see big anchors, just switching their kind of approach. And it's, that's seeing more of that, I think is what we need. And yeah, the NHS is kind of a bit of a leading light, I think, in that space at the moment. Another question here from Peter Orr, who's asking, don't we also have a crisis with democracy and deliberative decision making at the moment? Kate, you kind of alluded to kind of some of the democratic issues around this, but yeah, do you feel we've got a bit of a crisis with that at the moment?
Yeah. So and I'll just mention, I know there's a rise, and quite rightly so, of citizens' assemblies in the UK and elsewhere, and a rise of deliberative democracy, which is a great term. It's like democracy, it's not that moment of ballot paper in box, it's everything that happens in between. As Howard Zinn would say, that's what politics is. And how can we create more deliberative context? I have to say, I've been working with folks in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam and other cities there, and in Denmark, and when I hear the kind of the richness of the democratic engagement, I'm like, wow, I envy that. And it's often seeing another country's example, you think, oh, it could be like that. And of course they think it's not enough, right? They're frustrated. They want to create more engagement between policymakers, officials, and the residents and the civic networks. But wow, the depth of that. The example I'd love to bring, and I think is really inspiring, is from Japan. And there's a movement called Future Design there. So think of it's like a citizens' assembly, but it's around, like, say, local planning. It's been done in a town called Yahaba in Kyoto, and they bring city residents to plan, and they take half of them and put them in this beautiful yellow robe that says, you are a resident of this city from 2060. So we want you to stand in the shoes of the future and bring that long-term thinking. And unsurprisingly, these residents thinking from 2060, they are prepared to put in place far more radical policies that really think about the long-term stewardship of their place. So I really I think the world's only just begun really innovating with what are the different kinds of engagement and collaborations of this deliberative democracy. How can we make the best of the democratic system in the way it can be reinvented? And please, let's move away from the first past the post process in this country, because I think it's killing our political engagement, but also all the other ways that this can be enriched in local conversation.
Yeah. Sarah, any reflections for you on the kind of the democracy angle to all of this?
Yeah, well, I mean, just two quick thoughts. One is just we have got this process of devolution in this country. We've had devolution to Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, but we've also got devolution in a much more kind of haphazard way in England, and I think can we use that as an opportunity space to explore new mechanisms for participation? I'm not saying it's perfect, but it is a space where we can try different things and potentially explore how to give people the opportunity to participate in the process, and I think participate rather than just simply consult. I think trying to make sure that when we do when politicians and when governments do it, work with people, that it's meaningful and it actually can actually bring about real change. Like for example in the south of Ireland, the Citizens' Assembly, they're actually really changing the nature of the Irish Constitution. I think is an example of what is possible. But I think as well, there's also something important about recognizing that participation in democracy is also linked to the economy. That if you don't have a secure job, if where you live is not a good place to live and bring your children up, if you don't have security of tenure in your home, if some of those basic requirements in your life that Kate talked about in the donut, if they're not fulfilled, then there isn't a lot of space in there to participate in the democratic debate. So I think that's why, and it's why, people in this country with economic rights, who own property, who own companies, who have wealth, they tend to have a much stronger influence on the ballot box than others. And so I think, we've got to see the connection between democracy and our economy, and actually creating more generative economies, reducing inequality is actually also part of solving our democratic crisis.
Brilliant. We've got some interesting questions around funding. People kind of asking whether actually does this kind of activity require funding, and what are some of the challenges around that. you know, I don't want to, I suspect it doesn't need funding, right? This is about behavior change rather than kind of, you know, putting money into doing things differently. Kate, do you have any reflections on that?
Oh, I was just
go ahead, Sarah. Go ahead.
Say, what funding?
Yeah, go on, Sarah.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, people who are listening might have views on this, but I think, you know, we're still living through, you know, austerity and certainly in local government, where resources have been pared right back to the bone. And actually, I think a lot of the community wealth building movement has grown out of that frustration and necessity that we need a different approach. And you know, okay, so the government are throwing bits of money out here and there in terms of Levelling Up funds and community ownership funds, but you know, it's fairly inadequate for the challenges that we face. And I think instead of just, you know, the question, I guess, is about, do we need funding for this? And I think probably it's a bit of both. We need to use our existing funding in a different way, perhaps, and thinking about it less in terms of just purely delivering a service, but also delivering on some of the challenges that places face. So using it much more deliberately to tackle those issues, just like the example you explained from NHS, Tom. But I think as well, you know, there's a potential here. You know, funding does come into areas through inward investment or through business, and how can we, you know, how can we redirect that funding? How can we you know, make sure that funding actually makes a difference to places, as well as consciously trying to generate more wealth within a community. And that might be about, you know, because a lot of places, you know, especially those places that have been at the sharp edge of post-industrial decline, what you've effectively got is monopolies, you know, places that are just dominated by big extractive companies that employ people and perhaps at, you know, at the lowest, on the lowest wages. And I think trying to break that up and challenge it by encouraging the generation of new business, community organizations, community ownership, I think is essential in terms of, you know, it's actually breaking up those monopolies and creating a much more diverse economic environment for people to live and work in. So yeah.
And Kate, what about in Amsterdam then? Is there any particular funding streams being attributed to this, or is it, as I was saying, is it more about behaviour change?
Oh, particularly in Amsterdam, they brought, I mean, they use the donut particularly to create a circular economy. So they brought in regulation that sent a long, loud legal message to business that if you want to do business in the city, you've got to get circular. So it didn't start with funding, but of course we need funding. I just want to say, I was really struck reading Councillor Matthew Brown's book, Councillor from Preston. He wrote this fabulous book called Paint Your Town Red, telling the story of Preston. And of course, it begins with the shopping mall not being built. And that's not funding, but that's incoming investment. And as we said at the beginning, it's often places where the big investment didn't come that you have to say, okay, what have we got here? And of course, the beauty that emerges from that is, okay, we've got our anchor institutions and we've got our budgets and we work with that. That's an amazing start. And of course, it's not enough. And so, yes, funding, and there are streams of funding, COVID recovery, Build Back Better, all over the UK, across the world. There are these funds being created. And the question is, in the name of what? And I come back here, you know, the finance should be in service of what? And too many of these funds are still in almost a kind of knee-jerk, short-term fear-based way. We've got to reboot that economy we had, so it's got to bring in this much investment and going to old metrics of the economy, rather than saying this is the time to fund the emergence of the new economy, which has been waiting to emerge for a long time. It's more locally owned, it's more ecologically based, it's more community based, it has those denser local networks, and it thrives not because it's got some multinational investment in it, but because it belongs here. So ensuring that future finance, of course, goes in that direction.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. Well, I'm conscious of time. I mean, we could carry on probably for another hour on this stuff, and it really has been you know, a fascinating chat and a conversation. You know, I hope you out in the audience have found it kind of a really helpful and valuable debate. Yeah, I've had a great time kind of posing questions and engaging and think about it. And you know, yeah, the questions that you've been asking as an audience as well have been brilliant. So yeah, we really do appreciate kind of what your thoughts on this. But for now, though, yeah, I'd really like to thank Kate so much for joining us today, and for Sarah and kind of for both of you sharing so freely. Thank you again to the audience for your kind of insightful questions. But yeah, until next time, yeah, have a great afternoon, everybody. And yeah, thanks so much for joining us. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.